أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على الإمام الهدى والمتقين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your brother Abdul Rafiq coming to you again from our final episode in this series of conversations that we've been calling Convos with Experts. Alhamdulillah, it has been an engaging conversation. We have had very engaging conversations with a panel of experts that have come over the past few days. This is our 6th episode in this series of conversations. Inshallah, I think this would be our last one unless there is something that I feel that we haven't covered that may need another episode. I may think about it at a later time. However, for now, I think this would be our last conversation. I would like to thank our audience members who have participated in these conversations by commenting and asking questions, who have either joined through Zoom or have commented on my Facebook page. Inshallah, for this meeting, we're live on my Facebook page. So inshallah, engage with us, engage with our speaker today, with our guest today. Put your comments and your questions in the comment section, and this way we will address those questions. So for today's topic, we'll kind of wrap this whole conversation up and discuss the political aspects of the pandemic. We started off with discussing the disease, discussing what COVID-19 is. We spoke to physicians who are dealing with this crisis at the front lines. Then we transition into the psychological aspects of living in lockdown, in quarantine, and the stuff that we have to go through at home. Then from there, we spoke about the economic impact. We had a panel where we had a small business owner and an economist, and we discussed this whole crisis from an economic perspective, and discussed an alternative economic model, an alternative model to that would really that is really needed. And then the conversation before this, we spoke about how we have to look at Ramadan. So alhamdulillah, may Allah allow us to see Ramadan in the next few days. A unique Ramadan is upon us, and inshallah we will benefit from it, reconnecting ourselves back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So without further delay, I have with me brother Ali Harfouch. Ali Harfouch, he is a New Jersey native. He has a master's in political science from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. He comes back and forth from he's a lecturer at that university, so he teaches there, and then he comes back home towards the New Jersey area where his family is. So he travels quite a bit back and forth from the Middle East as well, and in the States. He has written a lot. You can follow him on academia.edu. I will post his link in my Facebook page to check out the stuff that he's written. He's written quite a bit about the Syrian revolution. He's been on Islam Channel as well. He's given interviews for that, and alhamdulillah, he does a lot in terms of the political analysis that is needed to really understand our global affairs. Assalamu alaikum, Ali. How are you?
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm good, Akhi Abdul Rafi. Barakallahu feek.
Barakallahu feek for giving us your time and inshallah allowing us to pick your mind a little bit. How are things in New York, New Jersey? You were in Lebanon a few weeks ago, and then now somehow they let you go and let you get through the quarantines and the borders, and then you're back home.
I was actually out of Beirut the same day they closed the airport.
Oh, really? Okay. So the
same
day they closed the airport in Beirut.
Yeah. So a few hours before they closed the airport, I kind of slipped out.
Really? Okay, mashallah. How are things there in Lebanon? I mean,
things in Lebanon, are pretty much as bad as they are on a global scale.
Really?
From a very dysfunctional system, very dysfunctional and failed political order in Lebanon. that if you've been following,
Yeah.
has led to a series of protests and
Hmm.
uprising.
And this was before the COVID crisis, the
Yes, this
protests
was
that
this
were
was
going on,
shortly
right?
before
Yeah.
COVID. This was shortly
Yeah.
before COVID, and actually it hasn't ended. The
I see.
protests
Okay.
are continuing in their own way.
I see.
Um,
Okay.
so Beirut has been very hectic. Uh, uh,
Uh,
for example, we had to suspend classes because of COVID in
oh.
spring, and in fall we had to suspend classes because of the protests.
Yeah, I see. Also.
So so
Mm.
it's been a very crazy year.
Oh,
Um,
subhanallah. How are things in New York, New Jersey? I know you've been
Actually
stuck
interesting.
in home.
Usually, you know what it is. Usually, this is actually a funny question because
Yeah.
usually when you go from the third world to the
Yeah.
first world, there's a change.
Hmm.
You go from, like this relative sense of instability and lack of normalcy and
Hmm.
whatnot. And, usually when I come back to the US, everything is fine and dandy.
Yeah.
But really, I came and I came to find things here are actually worse. Uh,
Really.
worse than
Yeah.
than
In Lebanon. Yeah.
route. So it was a very interesting and profound shock
Hmm.
that that this instability has hit the first world, has hit the center.
Yeah.
It's no
And
longer just on the peripheries or on the margins of the world.
yeah.
It's been a
Um.
very interesting, very interesting transition.
So you saw the third world in the first world.
Oh
you know,
yes, very
I
much
mean,
so.
we'll come to that actually. I wanted to discuss that with you also. Is that there has been some of the political thinkers and the journalists have basically said uh, America has been exposed to really being a third world country because of the healthcare crisis, because of its inability to deal with it properly, and so forth. But going into this the ramifications, right? Uh, Going into it in a little bit more depth. In your opinion, what has been the political impact of this pandemic?
Hmm.
We understand. I mean, we in this program at least we've discussed the healthcare crisis. We've discussed the economic aspect as well. We touched upon the political impact as well. But I wanted to hear from you, and that's one of the reasons I wanted you to be on this sort of a conversation, is because you have, because of your expertise and your background, you have the ability to assess what's happening in the Muslim world as well as what's happening here in the States. So, in your perspective, what do you think has been the political impact of this crisis?
I mean, profound political impact. I
Hmm.
think impact that we know of now, that we can account for,
Hmm.
certain fault lines that are rising to the surface, and I think there will be impacts that have yet to be seen.
Hmm.
Uh, First things first is, COVID is a black swan. Okay, usually when we engage with politics or political analysis, we deal with certain variables that are constant,
Hmm.
right? So when we want to make predictions or we want to analyze a particular trend or pattern in global politics, you have economy, geography, ideology, the global balance of power, which is
Hmm.
these are all relatively stable variables, and we make our predictions on the basis of such,
Hmm.
right? Especially in an age where the age of realism and new realism, this idea of predictability and um, politics grounded in a science, politics as being grounded in science and certainty. COVID was like completely black swan because it was a variable that literally came from outside of the spectrum completely, and completely disrupted all of the assumptions that we have about what it means to engage in political analysis and what sort of political factors um, affect politics, affect economy, and affect the global balance of powers.
Hmm.
So the very way we think about global politics, the very way we think about political analysis has been fundamentally changed and shifted. That's the first thing. The second thing is the fact that, like we were noting earlier,
Hmm.
that we have this global pandemic that has hit not so much the periphery or the third world, but that has hit the center, right? That has hit the first world. And this is also a very significant shift in global politics, right?
Mhm.
This is a development, I think, that also shatters many of the fundamental assumptions that we have had about um, the global political order and so forth. So, I mean, the devil himself has said it. Henry Kissinger, when he warned warned
It's a
basically.
good thing you brought him up. We're going to discuss a bit about him, but go ahead, complete your thought.
When I mean, this guy is warning,
Yeah.
basically that we are on the political leaders should be planning for a completely new age of politics,
Mhm.
right? That unless uh, 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 political leaders can win back trust in their institutions,
Mhm.
the world, as he says, will be lit on fire. The
Correct. Yeah.
global political order will be lit on fire. Now, keep in
Mhm.
mind, this is happening at a time, right? COVID-19, when we already have popular uprisings around the world. Okay, so in the same way, COVID is a global pandemic. We've also had certain global patterns prior to and ongoing, with that coincided with COVID, like
Mhm.
the protests in Venezuela, in Chile, and France, in Lebanon, and in various parts of the country. So popular uprisings, or what Brzezinski said, this new political awareness, plus coinciding with COVID, which
Mhm.
essentially stripped institutions of any sort of trust that they've had in the public eye, right? Definitely will produce a profound impact in terms of post-COVID global political order
Mhm.
and possibilities that emerge from that.
So, just for our audience, I just wanted to bring in a few things so that they can see what you're specifically speaking about. So this is the famed article that Ali, you spoke about. We did discuss this as well. What Henry Kissinger said about that the coronavirus pandemic will forever alter the world order. The part where you said that the failure could set the world on fire. That's the end of that quotation is at the end of this article, and in the middle is basically this is what he says is that safeguard the principles of the liberal world order. Um, you know, so these things, it's not just kind of Muslims speaking about this. This is something that is coming from the first world. It's coming from many political thinkers, journalists, and so forth. I just wanted to share this with our audience. I mean, just few of these articles. This is from the Financial Times. How the world will look after the coronavirus pandemic. They have Richard Haas speaking about it in this particular article. They have multiple authors. There's an article from The Guardian that talks about who will be the winners and losers in the new world order. An article from Al Jazeera, Paul Mason, who will coronavirus signal the end of capitalism. And then let's see here. How do I move this thing? Um, there's this article from War on the Rocks, written by two of
Very good article.
yeah. This is written by two of Joe Biden's entourage, basically, aftershocks, the coronavirus pandemic, and the new world order. I mean, I can go through again so many literature that's just come out just recently in discussing some of these things. So these guys, let me see, let me pull up a section here. It says another blow to the liberal international order. And they go through all of these things in there. So the point that, let's see here. So the point that I wanted to bring forth is that, you mentioned that, look, this is in the backdrop of so many other things that have been happening over the past few years. Um, you know, Especially after the 2008 financial crisis, there has been a rise of ultranationalism across European countries, across the United States, even in South America with Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? There has been the issue of Brexit coming along. There have been protests in the Middle East, but and then specifically for the Muslim situation, there has been events to, or conferences and events to basically tackle the politicization of the Muslims, right?
Yes.
So what you're saying is that this, just for our audience to understand, you're saying that added to all of this, now you have an external virus that somehow breaks this whole fragile world order.
Exactly. It amplifies and it magnifies existing fault lines and the existing contradictions that basically exist in a dysfunctional global order. We're no longer talking about
Mm-hmm.
pre-COVID dysfunctional failed states in the third world.
Right.
Now we're speaking about a dysfunctional world order that only amplifies and magnifies. And COVID has just amplified these fault lines and these contradictions.
So before we get into what exactly, how do we define a world order and what it is, I wanted to get this one point out of the way, is that, you know, there has been calls for, you know, because we live in globalization and all of that stuff, and all of these authors that I showed you, they all speak about that. Look, this is a time when nations will close down their walls, close down their boundaries. They want to no longer have this sort of globalization. For example, in Italy, there has already been calls that, hey, you know what, forget the European Union. The European Union did not help us, right? They want to go back and, you know, Britain, the Brexit situation.
Yes.
How do you see this? Do you see that the trend towards nationalism and moving away from globalization, do you think that will be the next step forward for many of?
100%. What we're witnessing now, what we're witnessing is a rapid deglobalization. Okay, this comes in the face of calls from, you know, people like Kissinger that what we need is multilateral cooperation.
Correct.
Right? These ideologues have recognized that the only way to save the existing global political order, the only way to save the Enlightenment project, to save the existing social contract, like Kissinger said, is multilateral cooperation. What we're is the complete opposite. We're witnessing rapid deglobalization. And I mean, this is something we saw in the 1930s, right? In the 1930s, when institutions began to falter, you know, when you had the banking crisis, there was a break in international economic agreements, and that led to annexations and revoking certain treaties and so forth, right? It led to the rise of economic nationalism. And this is exactly what we are seeing now. And interestingly, I mean, the global order, right, which the very same ideologues of the global order who are calling for cooperation, well, the global liberal order is fundamentally based on the logic of competition. It is grounded in the logic of the free market, coupled with the very idea of the nation state and the idea of nationalism, which is fundamentally and inextricably part of the global world order, the idea of the nation state. So nationalism plus competition in an age of crisis, no doubt this is going to lead to economic nationalism and increasing the existing inequalities, right? I mean, you can just imagine, right, that you have, in terms of cooperation, multilateral partnerships in terms of dealing with COVID. Imagine you have some countries like the Central African Republic, population of 4 million, have only 3 to 4 ventilators. Countries like Liberia or certain certain African countries are paying 10 times the average price for essential goods like face masks, and they're actually purchasing expired face masks. First world countries accusing each other of modern piracy.
Yeah.
And just right before like you noted, right before COVID, you know, we had the rise of Trump's America First, Brexit, populism, and so forth. So the very seeds of disunity and deglobalization are interestingly already embedded in a global order that is grounded on a logic of competition and a logic of nationalism. And that's, you know, why the calls of Kissinger will essentially be fruitless, right? Because contradiction is in the very system that you are trying to
save, basically. Yeah. So you kind of touched upon the definition of the world order. If you want, if you can you, for the audience, so that we have a complete understanding, what is the secular liberal order?
So the secular liberal order is essentially the idea that you have two kind of sovereign entities, right? You have the nation state,
Mm-hmm.
right? The liberal or the secular state that actually assumes authority when it comes to domestic policy, right? And then you have the global order, and which is really grounded in international institutions and certain institutional norms. Now, of course, the underlying principle is free market capitalism
Mm-hmm.
and nationalism. Nationalism being the common denominator for people living within a uh, uh,
Nation state.
certain borders.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and free market being essentially a mode of supposedly a mode of cooperation and interstate exchange and arrangements and whatnot.
Correct.
Now, if
And this is on the foundation of the secular principles, which
this
is
is
to
exactly,
separate
I mean, this is
the
exactly the product of
religion. Correct.
yeah, this is exactly the product of the liberal world order, of the enlightenment, of the secular enlightenment. So the very idea, for example, of nationalism, okay,
Yeah.
whole idea, nationalism essentially was supposed to provide an alternative common denominator that unites people within a particular territory in an
Mm-hmm.
alternative to religious identities. That's the
Mm-hmm.
very idea of nationalism. And the idea of the free market, an unrestricted free market, and the very idea of capitalism also emerged from from the presumption that the world that we inhabit is essentially a secular space, right? It is a space that is the dominion of Adam, the dominion of man.
Mm-hmm.
So the very logic of capitalism and nationalism is grounded in a certain assumption about the sovereignty of the secular, right? That's why Hugo Grotius, for example, one of the maxims, one of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, stated that when we think about matters of ethics and politics and
Mm-hmm.
economy, says that we must proceed as though God does not exist, right? We must
Mm-hmm.
proceed as though God does not exist, precisely because God is irrelevant to these fundamental questions. And then, so this is where the idea of the invisible hand comes in, the
Correct.
idea of an autonomous uh, uh, market, and the idea of uh, a non-religious uh,
Mm-hmm. So,
common denominator identity, basically.
Jazakallah khair. So, you know, sometimes I think, these concepts, global world order, secular liberalism, capitalism, sometimes it's a little difficult for an average person to understand, because they think, oh, this is politics, this is high level talk, this is doesn't relate to my day-to-day stuff. But the fact of the matter, and I think this is where we kind of have to break it down so that people understand, is that the fact of the matter is that your daily lives are affected by these things. They're built on these principles. They're built on these ideas. They're built on the principle of capitalism, the principles of secularism, and the global world order is is sustained by a leading state, which is United States, and other states competing. So everything that we see is coming from, whether it's in your personal life or in your societal life, or stuff that's happening on the globe, kind of falls into this paradigm. Am I okay to say that, Ali?
100%, brother,
Yeah.
100%. You know, like, because this is one of the things that I tell the folks back home in
Yeah.
Lebanon, that the very price that you pay for your socks, the
Hmm.
very price that we pay for our toilet paper is determined by the United States, is determined by, international economic arrangements and
Yeah.
whatnot.
Well, the toilet paper is
Nobody
more
is,
expensive than the dollar right now.
so exactly. So nobody falls outside the purview of global politics. We are all enmeshed in it, right? The
Right.
question is not whether we do politics. The question is who does politics for us. Either we do it
Mm-hmm.
for ourselves, or someone does it on our behalf.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's a profound point. Kind of, if you, it kind of reframes the way you look at what is happening in the news, really, right? Um, so let's move on here a little bit. So the question, like for example, Kissinger and all these other guys are speaking about, is that this global world order will collapse, or is under threat, right? the world will be lit on fire, like Kissinger said, or some of these other guys have mentioned. So the question really becomes is that, or the question really that stands is that we've had for the past century what I would say was the American century, right? The 20th century was the American century, where United States, uh, came out from the First World War on a world stage. Not that it wasn't powerful in its own sphere, in the northern and the southern hemisphere, but it had an impact after First World War, and it's from then onwards it's just been an American century where America has been the leading nation and has uh, basically had a say in everything that happens internally within certain countries or externally within the global politics. So the question then is United States uh, and who represents this sort of global world order, will it fight to the teeth to survive?
Well, look, in 1993, Brzezinski warned, he wrote a book called The Choice. And essentially
Yes.
what he said is like, look, the United States has a choice between either remaining an empire whose power and authority is grounded purely in political and military, economic and military superiority, or we return to the principles of the Republic and we try to an ideological model for the world. And what he said essentially was, look, the choice is really a non-choice because the US empire is already on decline. So what we need to do is we need to engage in multilateral cooperation to try to mediate the demise of the American empire. So the way that the policymakers decide to pursue or decide to mediate and handle the decline of the American empire, this will largely depend on, I think, the political administrations and popular opinion in the United States. Popular opinions in the United States are as, diverse as, on one hand you have, the Trump camp, and on the other hand you have, the Bernie Sanders camp, which is essentially a movement in the United States, which is gaining force and gaining attention and whatnot. So I think this
Let
largely
me pause you 1
depends.
second there, just for the audience. Brzezinski's Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was part of the Lyndon Johnson administration, and then later on he was the nation's national security advisor under the Jimmy Carter presidency. So he's a pretty well-known political strategist and a commentator. He's written a lot of books on the choice as well as the Grand Chessboard in the 1990s and so forth. Sorry to pause you, but I just wanted to make sure that people know who we are talking about. Sorry to cut you off, but go ahead, Ali.
And so this was in 1993, right? And we heard the same type of warning being made in 2008, and now the same type of warning is being made in the age of COVID, and in the age of the Arab uprisings and the age of populism and Brexit. But this time, the warning is far more dire. Okay, in 2008, right, when we talk about the United States, we saw a collapse. They spoke about the collapse of the roof.
Correct. Yes, the roof, the financial sector, the house.
Right? Yes, we saw a collapse of the roof, and so there were calls for essentially, rethinking about the global world order and the place of the United States. Today, we are witnessing a collapse of the foundations of the house. Because capitalism is fundamental. Here we're just talking internally in terms of domestic politics, right? Correct. Capitalism relies on people spending their wages and people going to work, right? Instead, we've witnessed that the United States has been forced to make certain, universal payments, central bank funding,
quantitative easing, stimulus packages and
easing and so forth, all of which go fundamentally against the logic of capitalism.
Correct.
So what Brzezinski said in 1993 and was repeated in 2008, today in the 2020, in the age of COVID, it's become all the more of a dire call. And if anything, it's become all the more obvious that the United States does not have the choice between choosing to be an empire or choosing to be a global political, global ideological leader, it is fundamentally on the trajectory of demise and on decline.
Mhm.
So, like I said, the question remains, how does the United States mediate this decline? Will it mediate it in a way that is disastrous, where it completely isolates itself from the global political community, or will it do so through multilateral cooperation? It seems, or actually, it's pretty obvious that they're choosing the more disastrous trajectory of
Correct.
decline through isolating oneself and completely burning any bridges that you have had with the international community. So the
So
post-American
I would say, just to maybe a
fragmented.
terminology should maybe not isolationism, but maybe more so towards unilateralism, right? I mean, because they're not really isolating themselves from the world. The United States, I think, they're becoming more nationalistic, more unilateral messaging, meaning that they want to do this on their own. They don't want to make these treaties. Would you agree with that sort of a?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely,
Okay.
definitely. I mean, yeah.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. I mean, so let me get some. There's been some questions that are coming in. Anybody, for the our audience members joining in on Facebook, Jazakumullah khairan for joining. I will be taking questions as we move along. There's a question here, or there's a rather a comment here from brother Abu Ghazi. He says Brzezinski died a few years ago, and he was an arch competitor with Kissinger, as both were leading strategists. They hated each other. Kissinger never referenced him in his work, talks, etc. Is that true? I don't know. I didn't know if
You repeat the question?
the comment is, he says Brzezinski and Kissinger, both leading strategists, they hated each other. Kissinger never referenced him in his work, talks, etc. Um, that's just the comment there. Allahu alam if that's probably that's the case. I don't know. I've never read anything where they have been disparaging against one another.
They've generally presented two different poles of
Correct.
political uh, political
Understanding. Yeah.
advisory, essentially two different poles of policy.
Okay. There, inshallah. Just 1 second. Let's take another comment here. This is from Hasnat Asad. He says, it is very likely that we will be moving towards a cashless society. With the emergence of a digital economy, surely fiat currencies, in particular the dollar, will suffer a demise. This is most likely to usher the end of Pax Americana. If this materializes, who will lead the new global order? Are we looking at Chinese expansionism, question mark, or greater Israel, question mark? You want to address that, Ali?
So I want to say one thing about that.
Yeah.
The current global crisis, it raises questions not so much about policy, but more so about philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
By that is it forces us to return to certain fundamental questions that are at the heart of any political order. Essentially, what is the human condition? What are the foundations for ethics? And what is the place of the human condition, the fragility of the human condition in the wider political order? So I think that it's not just a question of certain emergent policies, but global politics is forcing us to re-ask certain philosophical questions that, for better or worse, will push us into new avenues in terms of possibilities and whatnot. And I don't think we've understood just how profound this shift in thinking is. People are no longer really thinking about market choices,
Mm-hmm.
policy, but people are thinking about certain fundamental ethical questions, fundamental questions in terms of the underlying moral principles of the world order and of domestic orders. And so I think the question has to be brought to a more fundamental level than the question of cashless economies and digital economies,
Right.
so forth.
So I think the point, that's a good point there. I mean, let me expand on that a little bit. So the issue is, for example, connecting it to the American century. The last century was the American century. Most likely this century will be about America, that is the leading nation that holds up this world order, trying to preserve its empire. So hence you would kind of think about the situation as what the United States will be doing in terms of certain policies to maintain its global presence, to maintain its order, to maintain its disorder rather, and maintain the supremacy in the world. Now, if we kind of look at that from that level of policies that the United States is going to be implementing, or the European Union is going to be implementing, uh, then I think we're missing the bigger picture, like you're saying, because the question now is the fundamentals are up for debate. The fundamentals of secular liberal world order is up for debate. And that is where I think the real question comes in, is that, you know, how do we address those fundamental questions, and what do we offer in terms of an alternative? You agree to that, Ali?
100%. I think that that's just a moral responsibility. Okay, that's not just a moral responsibility that we have as Muslims, but it is a strategic imperative. Because even on a pragmatic level, okay, the boat is sinking. So there can be no alternative to fundamentally jumping off the boat and asking more fundamental questions about, or trying to envision a new world order, especially in the Muslim world, unless we want to sink with the boat,
right.
the name of pragmatism and in the name of realism and whatnot.
You raise a good point there about the issue of pragmatism, right? I mean, this is something that I think infects, I would really say infects the minds of Muslims a lot, is that, you know what, we got to make it work somehow. We got to think pragmatically. We got to think within the boundaries of secular liberalism, within the boundaries of capitalism, and somehow fit Islam into it. How do we address this issue there?
So, I mean, this is, you know, this very shallow form of Islamic realism, right? Well, that's no longer applicable, because what is real has essentially proven to be an illusion. This idea of a global enlightenment project, a global international order, and Muslims obtaining some sort of sovereign recognition within that global order, this has all proven to be an illusion, especially in the post-Arab Spring, especially, you know, after our experimentation with Arab democracies and the relationship between the United States and the Muslim world. So these have all proven to be illusions. Realism has proven to be an illusion, and actually it circumvents our capacity to gain a voice in global politics. So that's just from a strategic perspective. From an Islamic moral perspective, right? We know that the Enlightenment project, or the global political order, is fundamentally based on the logic of competition. Fundamentally based on the logic of free market capitalism, whereas Islam is grounded in a moral cosmology. So there is a fundamental clash between a world order, or between a political vision that is grounded in God, that is theocentric, that is grounded in revelation, and a world order that is grounded fundamentally in the logic of competition and in the logic of secularity and
So you're talking about clash
sovereignty
of
of man.
civilizations? I mean,
there's no doubt a clash. I mean, you know, I've never really understood why Muslims are sensitive. This idea of clash of civilizations, you know, sometimes Iblis used to say things that were true, right? Iblis taught Abu Huraira the Ayatul Kursi. That does not mean that Ayatul Kursi is flawed, right? So the idea of clash of civilizations, that there is a clash between the Islamic vision for global politics and a capitalist
view of life, right? Okay.
There's definitely a clash. Of course, there's a clash at the most fundamental of levels. You know, that's something that we should embrace.
Let me pause you here for a second, and I want to share a couple of things with our audience. This is from The Intercept. There was a podcast on The Intercept by Jeremy Scahill. He actually does quite a good job about on certain things. Independent reporter. He's written a lot about and spoken about Iraq and so forth. Basically, there was a podcast that said the failed state of America. One interesting quote that really struck during this particular podcast is that he says contrary to the rhetoric of American greatness, we are witnessing a failed state that placed all of its faith in the radical ideology of capitalism, the free market, at the expense of protecting the lives of our people. There was another author, Yusuf Kaplan. He is a Turkish author, Turkish reporter. This is from a Turkish newspaper, and he writes, "A new world order will be established, and Islam will have a key role in it." Actually, a very good article. Surprisingly, I didn't know about him until just recently when I started to read some of his old articles. A supporter of Erdogan, per se, I guess. But so so now, bringing those things in, and talking about Islam, you know, um, alhamdulillah, you addressed that point of being pragmatic. Really doesn't work. This is, we are in a situation, and I wanted to bring in some evidence also from the lives of the prophets. And if you look at all of the prophets, right, especially the ones who brought a new message, they came to rock the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They came to change the current world order, if you want to use those terms, of their times. So whether it's Musa alayhi salam, right? Whether it's Isa alayhi salam, whether it is Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, that there was a certain society that was present. There was a certain way of life that people had. There was a certain reverence to, whether it's idols or whether you take that and apply that to today's time, whether to reverence to the capital, to the secular, as you mentioned. And the Anbiya, they came to change that order. They came to change that world at that time, to bring it back to Islam. So this is, I think this is part of who we are as a Muslim. This is part of our DNA, that there is a message that we have that needs to change the current situation, that needs to rock the boat, that needs to sink it if we have to, if to make the Islamic view or Islamic worldview more clear, apparent, so that the people can follow. This brings me to this question then. Does Islam have a political system that can actually tackle today's fundamental issues?
Most certain. Otherwise, I think Islam would be irrelevant, because politics and economy
Hold on a
is
second. Let me. You're saying that if Islam did not have a political system, it would be irrelevant in today's time?
completely irrelevant, not only to today's time, it would be completely irrelevant to the very human condition. Because part of our natural constitution as humans is the centrality of our intersubjective relations, our political, economic, social relations, and so forth. So Islam as a deen would have been fundamentally irrelevant to the very human condition that it was revealed to address if it did not have its own political system. And I mean, the only way to really appreciate this is to consider that Islam is not a religion but a deen, right? There's a fundamental difference between religion, this Protestant caricature of an individual subjective faith, and deen as being that to which man essentially submits and as being a mode of being and whatnot. So Islam does have Islam does have its own political mode of governance, in the same way Islam governs the relations between man and wife, and man and his own cleanliness. Islam also governs political relations through the model we know as the caliphate. And this has been the normative model for Islamic governance, whether it is grounded in revelation, or whether it is grounded in our own long tradition, in our long history and whatnot. I think the missing link, though, between this normative, our own model of governance, normative model of governance, and the current global order, is how do we articulate that in strategic terms, right? How do we articulate that in strategic terms, in concrete political terms, right? In how is that embodied in terms of leadership on the ground?
So, I mean,
Age of the
then the
decline, if you
question, So when the question then comes is that if you're talking about a political order that Islam has, the response from a lot of people comes that, oh, you're talking about theocracy just like the Pope, you know, you want us to return back to a theocratic model.
So this is actually a very Eurocentric narrative, okay? Because the history of the Muslim world is Europe, and the history of Europe cannot be generalized to the history of the world, essentially.
Hmm.
The religious arrangements in Europe with Christianity were fundamentally different than that of Islam. And a theocracy is where you have a religious institution, a clerical establishment that essentially has sovereignty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's sovereignty of the church, so to speak, to put it very simply. Whereas in Islam, we have the sovereignty of revelation, the rule of law, the sovereignty of Quran, or of the Sharia. So it is fundamentally different than a theocracy in terms of the grounds of sovereignty and in terms of man-God relations.
So, well, so that there are certain things where whenever we talk about that, look, Islam has a political system. Um, the question that comes also, one is this issue of, oh, you're talking about theocracy, or if you talk about a caliphate, then they bring up, oh, look, you had your caliphate, you had your ISIS, this is what you want, this barbarism, you guys do not have anything of value to offer other than cutting and chopping and burning people, right? And the example that is given is ISIS. Look at these are the guys that this is what you want, a new caliphate, return back to the medieval ages of barbarism and all that stuff. How do we tackle this concern? And this is something that's actually been done significantly in the past few years, where this idea of the caliphate has been maligned and done so in a very concerted effort.
You know what's very interesting, okay? The arguments that ISIS represents true Islam and that a
Yeah.
return to the caliphate is analogous to returning to the model that ISIS provided. This actually fits into a certain narrative that uh, that the West has been pushing
Mm-hmm.
even before the rise of so-called political Islam. So the narrative, i.e., civilization or barbarism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Civilization or the barbaric world order versus disorder.
Disorder, yeah.
The barbarians are at the gate, so to speak. So
Mm-hmm.
this binary between either the West or disorder has really always been part of the narrative. Today, that the way that the West articulates that, Western policymakers, is, look, either you choose liberal democracy or it is ISIS. Either it is civilization as we define it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Enlightenment as we define it, or barbarism, a return to disorder and pre-modern times. Now, we don't have to succumb to that binary. We don't have to succumb to that. It is not an either or. It's not either liberal democracy or disorder. Now, with
Well, the
regard
liberal democracy in itself is in disorder. I
exactly,
mean,
exactly.
the stalwarts are saying it themselves, right?
So, I mean, we need to transcend this dichotomy where
Mm-hmm.
Muslims are forced to choosing between one or the other. Now, with regards to ISIS, I mean, look, even the most prominent Salafi, jihadi thinkers and scholars, okay, have condemned this movement, have condemned the practices of ISIS and the legitimacy of ISIS and so forth. So that's the first thing. I mean, there's nothing to be apologetic about, given that even the jihadi community, even the scholars that are considered to be authoritative by Al-Qaeda themselves have disputed the legitimacy of ISIS. That's the first thing. The second thing is that when we look at the emergence of ISIS and we look at what are the conditions that very much made it possible, we find that it is not its popularity within the Muslim world or something dysfunctional within the Muslim community, but it is that there was a security vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There was a security vacuum in the Middle East, right? Which which to a large extent was perpetuated by the political arrangement that we have now, known as Sykes-Picot and authoritarian regimes, which the West continues to support, despite the fact that they were critical in giving rise to groups like ISIS and Takfir al-Hijra in Egypt and the Khawarij movement and so forth, right? So if we truly want to deal with the political arrangements and the political instability that gave rise to extremist movements, then we need a strong political alternative in these regions.
And that political alternative cannot be the same liberal order that has actually caused this issue. I mean,
Or
you
the
have 20 years of
regimes.
Correct. You have 20 years of complete chaos that the United States and the Western governments have meted against the Muslim, the region there in the Middle East, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iraq, and so forth. Let me bring in a point here. This is a comment from brother, let's see here. He said, Brother Hasnat Asad, he says, I agree that the very values underpinning Western secular liberalism is under the microscope, but I'm genuinely concerned that a new conflict for full spectrum dominance is underway and a fundamental remaking of the world is underway. I think that's what we have been discussing so far. There's another comment here, says from Osama Muhammad. He says, America will remain as a political entity as long as it's not pulled off the ventilator it's currently on. Otherwise, it will recover. Maybe not fully, but to an extent. And nobody will be able to pull it off the ventilator, but another fundamental power that has a different view of life, different view of society, of happiness, of destiny, and most importantly, one that offers correct solutions for human beings and their problems. This is fundamentally true. Yes. Do you want to make a comment on that, Ali?
That's a moral and strategic. Yes.
Correct. All right. So before I go to the next, I wanted to, just to kind of hone in this point here, let me share a quote from a book. This is Islam and Liberalism by Joseph Massad. Very, very good book. It's interesting, some of the things that he said. He says, look, this pluralization of Islam as Islams with an S would allow the US to support the emergence of a new Islam, a liberal form of Islam that is more in tune with the US imperial designs. And he goes further and he says, while at the same time allowing the US to wage war against that other Islam, which continues to resist the Western neoliberal order. To this end, the US embarked on a new project once the new millennium started and in the shadow of September 11 attacks, one of reforming the culture of Islam. Let me just complete this here. It says, he goes further, he says, the current US project, however, has important British and French colonial precedents, of which it is merely a continuation. If in our times the US has been concerned about identifying the strengths and weaknesses of Islam and Islamism at present and in the foreseeable future, and has busied itself with coming up with the best strategies to oppose, contain, reform, transform, and co-opt Islam in order to neutralize its negative effects on American interests and mobilize different Islams in their favor. The question of reform of Islam in its entirety, or of its system of governance, or of its Sharia itself is a significant in this regard. I mean, these are amazing, I mean, you and I, alhamdulillah, we've read these stuff like this before, but he actually kind of articulates this really, really well. He goes into Wael Halaq and all these other guys. But you can see, the point that I'm trying to make here is that there has been a fundamental strategy by the United States and Western liberal democracies to liberalize Islam, to make multiple Islams, and support a certain vision of Islam that that does not affect imperial projects of the United States, of Britain, etc. And this has been a continuation for the past centuries. And this is key too, is that they want to co-opt the idea of the governance of Islam. So the political order of Islam, the fundamentals of what we understand as the caliphate and so forth. Ali, what do you think of this from this
I'm
quotation?
glad you raised that point.
Yeah.
You know, this dichotomy, this framing that Muslims must choose between Rome or the barbarians.
Mm.
Today it is articulated as liberal democratic Islam versus ISIS, versus the caliphate.
Caliphate, the radical Islam of calling for the
Exactly, which
caliphate,
is again a
or
regurgitation of the
political
very
Islam. Yeah.
exactly a regurgitation of the very same paradigm, Rome versus the barbarians.
Mm.
Now, when you go back to the broader Middle East initiative and you know, in the post-Soviet post-Soviet era of U.S. engagement with Islam, we see the United States pushing for this idea of a liberal democratic Islam, which in the late 1990s, early 2000 was encapsulated in the Turkish model, right? This
Mm.
idea of
Right.
that a liberal democratic Islam is possible.
And Turkey was given the example and
Exactly,
as being the model that
exactly,
the Muslims need to follow from here on.
exactly. And you know, there have been other policymakers who have pointed towards now, who are trying to point towards Tunisia, who are
Mm-hmm.
to certain parties, Muslim parties in Morocco and so forth, but the narrative has been the same, right? It's no longer articulated as either secular, you know, this naked, raw secularism versus the caliphate. It is now put in far more elusive terms, which is a liberal democratic Islam versus a barbaric Islam that, again, is embodied by ISIS and other movements, you know, other extremist movements and whatnot. So it's very important that we explicate, right? First of all, that we make this clear, that we bring this plot, so to speak, to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
That we are being forced into this frame to choose between one of two false illusions, right? And to recognize that there is a third alternative, that there is a third trajectory, right? Which does not subvert Islam to the liberal democratic order, and at the same time does not draw on the barbarism or on the shallowness of groups like ISIS and other extremist movements that have emerged in the past, you know, half decade and whatnot. That there is an alternative, right? There is a moral and there is a strategic alternative.
There's an ayah from Surah At-Tawbah, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى والدين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركين مشركون, meaning that Allah has sent this message has sent his messenger with the deen of haqq, with the deen of guidance, so that it may manifest itself, so that it may supersede itself, so that it may dominate over all other deens, and the mushrikeen detested, right, or the kuffar detested. This ayah, you know, I think it gives us a certain mission statement, because this is if you look at Islam from a holistic perspective, that it has a political system, it has a economic system, it has a social system, it has a political view of life, it has a way of fundamentally organizing society, which is quite different than the secular liberal orders. Then this ayah makes sense, because it has come as a deen to, you know, basically remove or supersede or to dominate, to prevail over all other ways of life, because it is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not coming from insan, it's not coming from person X, person Y, but it's coming from the Rabb of insan.
Exactly. And I mean, to bring this discussion all the way, you know, back to the whole question about COVID-19
Right.
and the global pandemic and whatnot. If we want to pose questions about policy, okay, questions about income, healthcare, uh, uh, and fundamental, you know, fundamental rights and inequality and whatnot, we cannot ask concrete policy questions before we ask more fundamental questions, fundamentally moral questions. When we cannot think about policy alternatives before we think about foundational alternatives from which we articulate these policies.
Mm.
So even on the concrete level of rethinking policy, right, healthcare policy, we cannot but return to our foundations, right?
Like how we look at life, how we look at healthcare, how do
Exactly.
we assess how do we view disease, or how do we view life itself? That's what you're speaking about, correct?
Exactly. An alternative really to uh, this enlightenment social contract that, again, I said is grounded in the idea of, the sovereignty of man on one hand,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Sorry, your last sentence got cut off.
So, an alternative to a social contract, a secular social contract that is grounded in, the very idea of competition and
Okay.
the sovereignty or the primacy of profit and power.
All right. So, what is this model then? What is this alternative model?
Look,
If you
it
want to
should be
define
clear.
it sorry, if you want to define it for the average Muslim, what are you guys talking about, man? Like, what is this model that you guys are talking about?
It should be articulated very clearly. It should be articulated very boldly, and it should be articulated on unambiguous terms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is what I would like to call a new Medina, right? The caliphate in the 21st century. Okay, the caliphate as a strategic model, as a strategic alternative, and as a moral imperative in the 21st century. This should be the roadmap, and this should be the mission, the vision moving forward. Especially now when the boat is sinking,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's become a non-choice. It's become
Mm-hmm.
essentially what are the alternatives, trying to articulate some kind of new liberal democratic Islam that is also
Mm-hmm.
based on austerity and that is also based on the logic of competition and depending on international institutions that are faltering, as for example we see in Turkey.
Yeah.
Barbarism of ISIS,
Mm-hmm.
instability, authoritarian regimes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So from a strategic perspective, what is the alternative? From a moral perspective, what is the alternative? Right? Morally speaking, can we hold on to a system which in which primacy, which makes idols out of the market, which makes idols and false gods out of capital, which controls the price of wheat and bread and sugar and fundamental essential goods, which ties these essential goods to the dysfunctional U.S. currency? Morally speaking, can we still hold on to that kind of world order? Just from a moral perspective, I mean, this is a question that even a non-Muslim can appreciate,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or do we need to start thinking about fundamental alternatives? We need to rethink just the human condition, the place of ethics and morality in the global order. These force us into a radical. And like I said, there can be no ambiguity and
Mm-hmm.
ambivalence in regards to this, right? A new Medina, and as I said, in strategic and in moral terms, that is the caliphate.
So you're not you're not talking about the Medina state that Imran Khan is trying to build in Pakistan, right?
Oh no.
Okay.
No. If he called it New Medina?
He called the Medina state, yeah, basically the new Medina state or something like that. So
Oh
the
no,
Medina term,
definitely not.
yeah. So your terminology has been co-opted by Imran Khan to still fit into the secular liberal model. You should have, but that's what he used, and I think it's pretty. Um, Anybody who follows Muslim politics and so forth, you'll see that the demand for Islam and the Islamic principles in the political sphere is high among the average person, among the average Muslims. So what happens is certain governments have to somehow co-opt that political aspect and use terminologies like this. I'm going to build a new Medina and say, okay, this is the Medina model, right? And I think that's the term he used, but the Medina model, to say that, look, it's reflective of the state that Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam established in Medina. It goes to show that they have been trying to manipulate and trying to deceive people and and bring ambiguity in this idea of the Khilafah or the Caliphate.
Yes, 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 no doubt.
Same thing with Tunisia, right? You mentioned Tunisia with what's
Rashid al-Ghannouchi's movement.
Ghanouchi and all these other guys. Yeah. So if this is what we are offering as an alternative to the secular liberal world order, a new Khilafah, a new caliphate, a caliphate that is built on the fundamentals of Islam, on the aqidah of Islam, that deals with Muslims and non-Muslims based on the principles of Islam, then I think one idea needs to be clear in the minds of the Muslims that, look, what you and I are calling for, this is a fundamental aspect of Islam, right? This is part of the of your aqidah, correct? What do you say, Ali, to that?
Yes, because again, in Islam, there is no conception of God as being purely this cosmic creator who is,
who doesn't have any relation to what you do in life.
And from the spatial temporal world.
Mm-hmm.
It says, and it is he who is a God in the heavens, and it is he who is a God on earth.
Mm-hmm.
Very fundamental idea of a secular order in which we must proceed as though God does not exist. Again, drawing on the Enlightenment, is irreconcilable and fundamentally at odds with the Islamic vision, where preserving the human condition depends on preserving the centrality of God in the global political order or in the domestic political order. And the centrality of God is, again, this translates into the centrality of a moral cosmology.
There's a question here from Brother Hasnat Asad. I know the Khilafah is incompatible with the current nation-state model, but based on the current political landscape, from which country do you see the impetus for a Khilafah emerging?
Mm-hmm.
What do you say, Ali?
I mean, this is a very good question. This is more of a strategic question. So the popularity of, Islamic governance and, this articulation of an Islamic alternative is pretty much widespread.
Mm-hmm.
As where and from where can this model emerge? Well, I think that's based on, which country has the domestic, the internal and external capacity to basically establish an independent sovereign state. I mean, Pakistan is one such model, right? Pakistan is definitely one such model. The Jordanian, Jordan, Syria is essentially, of course, one such.
The Sham region in general, you mean?
The Sham region,
yeah.
And of course, you have certain countries in Northern Africa and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So this is more of a strategic question, that will depend on certain factors on the ground, like I said, domestic and external capacities of these nations.
Right. So, there's another question that comes in. When we talk about, okay, a new caliphate, a new khilafah, one, it says, people will say, look, the West will never allow it to happen. And second, it will say that you're talking about a dream, not a reality, that you're building castles in the sky, right? This is not something that can happen now. And thirdly, they will say, look, this is something that is not viable in current modern times, right? This was a pre-modern concept. It's a pre-modern form of government. It does not function in today's complex societies.
It would not function in its functional order, of course.
It would not function in a dysfunctional order.
Of course. So if we try to fit it into a dysfunctional global order, yes, it won't be sustainable.
Correct.
If we try to fit it into, if we try to establish an independent, autonomous state. And again, when I say independent and autonomous, I do not mean full autonomy and independence, right? I mean in terms of ideological and political autonomy. If we try to establish it within within the international order, the myth of international recognition, the myth of the international community, then yes, it is an impossibility. But to begin to think outside of the box, outside of these dysfunctional paradigms, international recognition, and global markets and so forth, then it not only becomes a possibility, it becomes an inevitability, right? It becomes inevitable. It becomes a strategic imperative.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that it is not possible, or the idea that it is dreamlike, again, this I think results from our inability to think outside of the box, our inability to think about the post-capitalist world, right? Think beyond the logic of capitalism. In other words, our inability to jump off the ship, at least mentally speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think and if I could add to that, is I think it's a fundamental issue also, because, for somebody to think beyond the box that they have been put into, right? For us to think beyond the secular liberal order, unless or until you are able to imagine the alternative, unless or until you're able to conceive these ideas as being from your aqidah, as being part of Islam, you're never going to get out of that box. You can always be in that, right? If you start from Islam in a sense that I have to somehow reconcile Islam within the parameters of secular liberalism, then you're stuck. Then you can't take Islam beyond that, right? You can't take Islam beyond those parameters if you are viewing Islam so as to reconcile it into secular democracy, into, okay, we want to call for like the quotation I mentioned, the plurals of this pluralistic sort of Islam. How do we make people think beyond the boat? How do we take people to think that, what, you got to rock the boat, man? Because you have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's word. You have something that is so magnificent, and Ramadan, is right here. You have something that you have to offer this dunya. You can take people out of this misery. I mean, like just this week, now the unemployment rate in the United States reached 22 million people. Within 3 weeks, 22 million people are unemployed. There's a food banks. People are looking for food. There was 10,000 people lined up in San Antonio, Texas, just to get food. And when you have millions of gallons of milk and other crops are being destroyed on the flip side, right? This is the society. This is the society that we live in. I mean, I can give off numbers, and everybody knows. I mean, there's billions of people who live below poverty lines. You have mass incarceration. You have deaths that thousands of people die every day because of hunger. So how do you tell people, look, man, you got to rock the boat. You got to think outside this box.
Well, I mean, one of the obstacles towards doing so is, normalcy. Usually under the illusion of stability and normalcy, which has generally been the case for Muslims living in the West and Muslims living in the United States, it's kind of difficult to think outside of the box, to kind of think beyond the parameters of the existing order, because normalcy has its own way of preventing us from thinking about certain fundamentals, of being able to imagine possibilities that exist post-capitalism. Now, with COVID, right, it has been suspended. Our day-to-day life, has been fundamentally altered and whatnot. So I think that people now are going to be forced to think about certain fundamentals. That's why, again, with COVID, we are forced to think about questions that pertain not to policy, but to ethics and morality in the human condition, and the place of God in our political order and so forth. So I think it's inevitable that people will have to think back to these fundamentals. The second thing, I think, is that shifting thinking, Muslims have to shift their thinking from the level of pure power politics and policy issues, to the questions of fundamentals and the question of order, right? Questions of the foundations of political order. Because we take for granted, when we talk about policy and we talk about healthcare and whatnot, we take for granted certain foundations. We take for granted of a particular order. This order, these foundations are sort of invisible. and it appears as though we are just talking about, policy and whatnot. So bringing back the discussion to fundamentals, I think, is essential, right? And what I mean by that is the question of aqidah. Fundamentals refers to the questions of aqidah and our worldview, you know, those fundamental questions that we ask in relation to man and morality and God. Um, and that is the direction I think that even the non-Muslims are moving towards, where questions about finance, market choice, and financial policy are becoming irrelevant. The questions that are now being posed by, like the movement, Bernie Sanders movement, and the progressive movement in the US and in other places of the world, they're beginning to ask fundamentally moral and ethical questions. They're shifting the scope of the discussion. This is even in the non-Muslim world.
Well, that brings an interesting point, because the Muslims in the United States specifically, they had their hopes with Bernie Sanders. I mean, this is kind of besides the main discussion that we were just having, but since you brought it up, their sort of vision for the next 4 years was that, oh, you know what, Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders democratic socialism will kind of take this country back to its correct path, per se, right? And it will be effective for the Muslims. So even then, we see that the reliance on these ideas that are still within the liberal framework, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And this is again where the pragmatism comes in, right? So we got to make things work, per se, and especially when the question now becomes is, oh, you guys are gonna, because Bernie just handed in the towel and he's like, okay, I'm gonna be with Biden now. So we're not getting anything different, really.
Yes, and I think, I mean, look, if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that domestic politics cannot be understood um, uh, and even practiced without a consideration of global politics. Okay, and I think this is the problem for Muslims in the United States, that they are continuously entrapped within this minority thinking paradigm, right? That,
Mm-hmm.
what does it mean to be a Muslim in America? Well, then obviously, if you are thinking at that level as this minority complex, then the only choices you really have were Biden, Trump, or Bernie Sanders. But again, 2008, the Arab Spring, and um, COVID-19 show us that no, we need to shift our thinking to a more global level. Even if we want to influence domestic policy, we must be able to think globally and act globally. Global politics is essentially what determines domestic politics. A global voice, global power, global provide us with domestic autonomy and so forth. So it's really, like you said, thinking outside the box and being able to rock the boat, being able to transcend this minority complex, and thinking global levels, which essentially align with the idea of the ummah, that we are part of a global majority. We are not part of a domestic minority.
It's let me get this question here. It's from Zaid Hanini. He says, I think it's easy to say we should be thinking outside of the box, but many of us who grew up in the West only ever had exposure to an educational system where thinking outside of the box is not taught or instilled in the individual. What would you recommend us Muslims do to train ourselves to think out of the box, or to educate ourselves on the topics required to push this narrative? I mean, that's true. I mean, this is a very good question, actually. I mean, that's true with all of us, you and I included, that there is a certain way, and I'm gonna just kind of add to that question. There's a certain way that we were taught Islam, which whether it's within the box, within a certain liberal order, or thinking of Islam as just rituals and ibadat, and not having a complete alternative system. This is very common to a lot of people, very common to the average Muslim, whether you live in the West or whether you live in the Muslim lands.
Yeah.
So the question that then that becomes is what Zaid Hanini is asking. How do you break that?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like you said, the problem is that the existing models, okay, you know, is we view Islam as an ethnicity, one of many ethnicities, or one of many religions, you know, all that exist within, you know, exist in this melting pot known as America and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step would be to fundamentally rethink Islam on its own terms, and Islam on the terms of Islam, and not to understand Islam on the terms that have been imposed upon it by uh, the melting pot or by this Protestant caricature of religion and so forth. And this is essentially, you know, as cliche as it sounds, to again understand Islam on the basis of the Quran and the Sunnah. So to ask questions, what does it mean to adhere to a deen?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the implications of the Islamic Aqidah? What is Islamic Aqidah? And what are the systems that emanate from the Islamic Aqidah? Now, there have been contemporary thinkers, you know, late thinkers who have articulated these questions, right, who have posed these fundamental questions. You know, Al-Mawdudi, rahimahullah, Sayyid Qutb, Taqiyuddin al-Nabahani,
Mm-hmm.
Ali Shari'ati, and so forth, right, who have, again, put these questions forward um, in terms of what does it mean to reconsider Islam on its own terms.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. I mean, I think the other part, I did mention this in the beginning also, is that, you know, uh, we have to view Islam as being a transformative message. Yani if we want, if I'm teaching my kids Islam, if I'm teaching at Sunday school or whatever, I cannot take the political aspect of Islam away. I cannot take this fundamental idea that Islam came to change society, to change the current world order. It came to change the status quo. It didn't come to fit in. I mean, this is something I think um, it's a fundamental understanding of of Islam itself, and how do you view Islam from its basis. That, and if we don't impart that, then you're kind of missing the whole point of Islam. And that's why I give the examples of, if you look at all the Anbiya that came, they came to change their societies. They didn't come to just somehow fit in into the current system. They didn't. So Musa alayhi salam is not compromising and fitting in within the courts of Fir'aun, right? And so is Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He's not trying to fit in and try to be part of uh, the government, right? He's there to fundamentally change the societies, and that's where I think, if you look at Islam in that sense, you definitely have a alternative order that needs to be put in, that needs to be placed, that needs to be implemented, so that you can actually, like Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, take people out of the darknesses into the light of this deen. Let me, as we come, we're kind of going over time here. Let me get in one more question here. Um, is the alternative that you and I just spoke about, is that something that is on the horizon? Is that something that we have to look forward to? Is it something that will become a reality? Oh,
So this is the answer to that question depends on whether or not we as Muslims want to put it on the horizon. Okay, so unfortunately, usually we have this idea of this Masonic idea of that you know, Salah ad-Din will magically appear somewhere in the Muslim world, that the Messiah will you know
the
erupt.
Mahdi will come. Yeah.
There will be this fundamental eruption and displacement of history, and you know the savior will come, whether it's a white savior or the Mahdi and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So the real question, Abdul Rafa, is will we as Muslims put this on our horizon? And by that I mean viewing the caliphate not as a dream or as some kind of receding vision, but as a strategic objective, right? As an alternative in the post-capitalist world. So that's the real question. It's whether we are bold enough to do so, right? And in the Muslim world, speaking as someone who is in the Muslim world, coming from the Muslim world, that Muslims have reached a point where, that boldness and that uh, ability to articulate it and to place it on our horizons is definitely there, right? Now a question of leadership. It's now a question of how do we transform and transition into that post-capitalist caliphate model and so forth. But in terms of Muslims in the United States, it's a question of whether they are bold enough and able to put it on their horizons.
And to call for it, basically. Right. There's a question here. It says, Fuad Said, are you suggesting that Muslims work to fundamentally change American society or work to establish an Islamic order, global order in the Muslim world that will bring fundamental change, will bring about a fundamental change? Yes, of course, what I think we're speaking about establishing an alternative world order in the Muslim lands, because that idea of the caliphate, the idea of ruling by Islam, this is inherently from within the aqidah, within the minds of the Muslims, and that would be its normal seat. Would you agree to that, Ali?
100%, yes. Being part of a global movement, being part of a global vision. Yes.
There's a question here. Zaki Muhammad Tahir, he's asking, what are some practical tips to continue dawah while in quarantine? Would you suggest video chatting with brothers, or is that a bad idea? I mean, you could video chat, you could call, you could message on WhatsApp, use all the tools that you have, inshallah. I think
family also, focus, work on your family as well.
Work on your family as well, correct, yes. And inshallah, these are things that you can do. There's another comment coming in. It says, so what do Muslims in the US do until that world order is established? Who's this guy, man? I'm asking pointed questions. Fuad Said, he says, so what do Muslims in the US do until the world order is established? Ali.
Broad question, because it's not what do we do until that order is established. We must have a fundamental role in the establishment of that order, because states live in the belly of the beast, so to speak, in the very palace, like Musa Ali, raised in the very palace of Pharaoh. So especially, like in a globalized world, interconnected world and whatnot, that the Muslims in America play a fundamental role in that global movement.
Yes.
It's not an issue of waiting.
Exactly. I think what you said it really well is that, you are in the belly of the beast. You can see you can see where the whole liberal order is. You can see what's going on. You can see everything that United States is going through, and all of that stuff. So you and I are best suited to sit here and say, you know what, we disagree with this particular world order, right? We disagree with these fundamental ideas of secular liberalism and capitalism, etc. And when you offer an alternative and you articulate it and you work for it and you say, you know what, this needs to be the solution, it has a lot of value, right? It has a lot of value because you can project that and you can say, look, I am sitting here, I'm rejecting Fir'aun while in his court, right? Like you said, Musa alayhi salam, the example that you gave. So alhamdulillah, I think, this is something that we have to take with. I mean, and for the audience, I just wanted to mention that, I forgot to put up your link to your academia edu. Hold on a second. I'll put it on the Facebook feed. So you can check out Brother Ali Harfouch, mashallah, jazakallah khair for coming in and enlightening us. You can Google him. It's Ali S. Harfouch. He'll show up he's on Twitter. He also has his papers and articles that he's written quite well on academia.edu. So just put in Ali Harfouch, you should be able to get it from there. Let me see if I can actually put it up on the comment section. But I think it might just cause an issue here. Hold on a second, I'm getting a double feed here. There you go. Sorry guys for the technical issues. But just check his page out in our comment section. I put it his link here. He, mashallah, he's well read, he's written quite a bit on subjects like these. I think we will close here. We just ran out of time a little bit, but I think these were very good discussions. Jazakumullah khairan Ali Harfouch. May Allah reward you. Barakallahu feekum ajma'in. And inshallah, he's active on Facebook as well, so reach out to him. You can ask him questions. Inshallah, if there are other questions, Ali Harfouch will be gladly to comment on my particular Facebook page. With that, I would like to basically thank all of our participants, our guests that have come in over the past few days, our participants on the Facebook page and then the Zoom who have asked questions and commented. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah Azza wa Jal reward everyone. It has been interesting times, and we have probably lived in times that we've never imagined in our lives. We have Ramadan coming up in the next few days, so that's going to be a very, very unique Ramadan. Inshallah, Allah Azza wa Jal allows us to see Ramadan and be able to come closer to Him during this month, and may Allah Azza wa Jal give His barakah to us during the month of Ramadan. We started with the name of Allah Azza wa Jal. We will end with His name. May Allah Azza wa Jal protect us in this pandemic. May Allah Azza wa Jal allow us to meet Him in Jannatul Firdaus and meet the Sahaba and meet all of us there. May Allah Azza wa Jal forgive our sins. May Allah Azza wa Jal protect us and grant us the ability to articulate His deen. Grant us the ability to convey this message of Islam to the rest of humanity. With that, wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakumullahu khairan. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.